Welcome to the Global Affair podcast, brought to you by Love Out Loud, the world's largest love-based movement, actualizing a civilization of love by 2030. My name's Nicole Gibson, and join me and some of the world's brightest minds as we bring some of the most important and controversial conversations of our time into a space of unity. It's important to know that as your host, this isn't about my personal opinion or bias, but rather an opportunity to listen with love, honesty, curiosity, and reveal the true universal experience us humans have amongst the differences. So if you love the show, please let us know by giving us a rating and tell us how to make this conversation easier for other people to jump into as well. And with that, let's get it. Welcome back to the Global Affair. I personally have been waiting to have a conversation like this for so long, and the conversation is about network states, otherwise known as microstates, and in the bigger kind of vision, something I see as like sovereign nations. We're here again with Sana. Thank you for joining us as the co-host of the Global Affair.
Thank you for having me.
Always a pleasure. And we have Niklas and we have Laura, and we've all been at the Longevity DeSci conference here in New York. We just heard from Stephanie, so you know what lifespan.io is all about. And there's been a few different tracks of very interesting conversations, but this conversation in particular, I really do think is something very special and revolutionary for a multitude of different reasons. And you guys are going to be able to encapsulate that so much better than me. So maybe we begin. Niklas, if you could sort of summarize your work for us, your background, and what your mission is. How would you define your mission kind of for humanity on planet Earth right now?
Great. Thanks for having me, Nicole.
Of course.
So my mission with Infinita, which is a venture capital fund, is to unleash a new wave of technological progress by utilizing network states in startup cities. So I've come to the belief, based on thinking, reading for years and years, about what makes technology development in several areas where we could have expected much more, such as energy, climate, biotechnology, life extension. Why are we not progressing faster? My conclusion has been that it's regulatory bottlenecks and a flawed paradigm that I call regulatory monopoly. And I think within these new network states and new jurisdictions, we can develop a better model that can enable technology and innovation to flourish like it hasn't before.
You know, one thing that I often sort of share with my team is we've got to think about whether or not we want to be rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic or building a new boat. And I'm curious, you know, how much of that philosophy and thinking has driven you to really want to not necessarily try to advocate and work within the paradigms of, you know, the real world, so to speak, and actually attempt at creating infrastructure in an entirely new form of nation.
Yeah. So there's this saying about exit, voice, and loyalty, right? So loyalty is within the organization, you continue like it was before. Or you use voice, which means you want to do things different. You speak up, you want to reform things. Or exit, you leave the organization and do something else. And I think these are recurrent features of humanity that we're using throughout all our civilizational life or design. And, you know, we need loyalty to build lasting organizations. And I think reform and voice is very good and very important. And exit is not mutually exclusive with the other, right? So it's just to try out new things that are unencumbered by entrenched interests. And I hope my work that I do in special jurisdictions, proposals how to do regulation differently, can also inform voice and reform in existing jurisdictions, such as the United States or the UK and in any other country around the world that wants to see how they can do it better. And we can sort of give them the data to show them, hey, here's a better way.
So it's really about creating kind of like a proof of concept model that all nation states, even those that exist, can kind of draw from. And before we hear about Laura's amazing work, just last question on this. I'm curious, over the years you've been working on this model, how many of the kind of traditional quote unquote structures have you felt inspired enough by to actually keep within the network state
of the existing
incubators?
Structures in nation states or existing
in the world?
I mean, there's a lot of things that are going right? I mean, in many parts of the developed world, we have good governance. We have relatively functioning institutions. I love Berlin. I love Europe. I think the transportation system there is very good. And we should never forget where we're coming from.
Absolutely.
Right? In the history of humanity, we're at an unprecedented high. Right? And we have been advancing a lot in the last 300 years. I just think about 50 years ago, we stopped advancing as rapidly as we did before. That's the kind of the corrective that I want to find. But there's still, if you could do or implement the same institutions that we have in the developed world in much of the developing world, like in Africa or Latin America, that would be a good thing. So there's many good institutions that we have nowadays.
I have a question, actually. I think it would be good for our audience to actually define what a network state is. Like, what are we talking about? What is the idea behind it, and who originated the idea?
Yeah, so the idea of the network state is coming from a book by someone named Balaji Srinivasan, who's the former CTO of Coinbase, who's very deep into crypto and general partner at A16Z, a venture capital fund. And it is an exit idea, right? So it is in the space of newer competitive governance. What many people don't know is it's in addition to the space. So there were attempts before, such as seed-setting or charter cities. And network states, what Balaji is doing, in my interpretation, is he looked at the models before, like the charter city model, which says, all right, we're going to get a jurisdiction, we're going to build a city, we're going to build institutions, and then we get demand or build a community. And he was saying, and there's notable successes to that model, but he was saying that takes too long, right? So it's very hard to get started. You need to have a lot of capital, a lot of experience, a lot of credibility. What if we flip the model on its head? What if we start with community first and then land in territory and building institutions second, right? You first have the demand, a highly aligned online community, such as the Longevity community or the Ethereum community, which coined or led to the creation of Zuzalu, and then have them meet in the real world and build great things and start building institutions.
Fascinating. Let's come back to that. Laura, hi, welcome to The Global Affair.
Thank you for having me here.
It's a pleasure. And, I was really entertained and somewhat enthralled by some of the perspectives you had in our earlier conversation. But first, tell our audience a little bit about your mission, your why, some of the work that you're doing and the background that's led you there.
So I lead an organization called AthenaDAO, and our mission, and my personal mission, is to advance women's health research. I don't think a lot of people know, not even a lot of women know, that women's health is highly overlooked. The reason we go to the doctor and they tell us it's just your hormones and it's okay, you're a woman, is because
no one knows.
it's that time of the month. It's because we're not funding the science that can actually get us the therapeutics or to even diagnose things like endometriosis properly without having to do 8 operations, or menopause, to know when women are going to have menopause, which is not all women are going to have children, but all of them are going to have menopause.
Sorry, I'm not wanting to cut you off. I'm actually wanting to go deeper into that specifically because I found that so fascinating in what you were sharing yesterday, that there's no biomarkers to actually determine menopause.
Nope.
That really blew my mind. I
mean, when you think of it, at the turn of the century, there was a whole concept of hysteria, right? Women at certain points, like, they're hysterical. And it probably is that they were just going through menopause. But it's something that we still don't have proper management. I mean, the only thing we have is HRT. It's very controversial. Not all women can have it. Women that have propensity for breast cancer or have had it cannot use it. So we're basically at the cave times of science, almost, when you think of where we're at with women's health. And it doesn't make sense to me because we're half of the world's population. Look at the success. I'm not a Barbie person, but look at the financial success of Barbie, $1 billion. So that means that women have the capital and the purchasing power for getting, if you bring products to them, if they work, if they like them, women will be your best customers. And if women had access to good medical science-backed products, they would use them. Just as a factoid, 80% of healthcare decisions at home are made by women.
I believe that.
And yet biomedical pharma only spends 1% of their R&D outside of oncology on women's health and female-specific conditions.
Yeah. We also talked about that the introduction of women even for clinical studies.
It's been 30 years.
It's crazy.
Yeah.
Even now it's pretty rare. So when you get a recommendation for a drug, you don't know if that's been tested on women predominantly.
Yeah, I mean,
women are very expensive to study.
For the longest time, they would think, women are about 25% smaller than men, so let's just reduce those by that. I'm not thinking of other factors.
Okay. The question here is, do we need women to populate these network states?
We do. I did have a talk at Susalu, especially
Yeah.
specifically about that. And my big thing in the longevity space
Mhm.
is always reminding the longevity crowd longevity crowd that we need to think of reproductive longevity. Because what if we achieve LEV, which, longevity, escape velocity, but women would have gone through menopause. So these guys are going to be vibrant and then be with women that are postmenopausal at that point. The other aspect of it is, I always say, I'm going to believe longevity is possible when we reverse ovarian aging. Simply because it's the easiest. We could do longitudinal studies with ovaries. It's a great model to study longevity. The other thing is the only organ that dies inside a human. Men don't have that, like women have that. So longevity is going to be possible when we actually crack ovarian aging, and not that many people are looking at it.
Can you actually share your experience as a Zulu and just tell us a little bit about what the experience was like, what the whole thing was about?
Please.
Yeah.
Well, I'm so fascinated. How long were you there?
So I got in as a resident, but at some
wait, actually, let's tell the audience maybe explain what Zulu is, because Niklas is also.
Well, it's a network state. It was something that it started by Vitalik Buterin, who's one of the co-founders of Ethereum. I think if you're in crypto, it's a very well-known name. If you're not, look it up. But it was his idea. I think the whole concept is bringing people with similar ideas to workshop on new technological advancements. So there was AI, there was network states, there was synthetic biology, there was longevity. And the whole idea is just bring like-minded people in a way that didn't feel like a conference, but just a way to share ideas. Like a pop-up
city?
Yeah, so you could do socials, dinners, have talks, workshops, parties. And
how long did this go for?
2.5 months.
Okay.
2 months.
Yeah. And
there was University's done sort of,
yeah, it's like a campus.
Yeah.
But a campus with a lot of adults.
And equally childish behavior, I have no doubt.
Yes. Well, I got so you could be invited, and if you were invited, you could be a resident. And I got in as a resident, but I'm like, I'm not gonna be able to live there 2 months. And for the 2 weeks that I was there, I had a lot of FOMO all the time. So my work, I thought, I'm so glad I didn't live here at that time, because you have FOMO. You want to be at everything. Oh. And it's very hard to stay in your studio or hotel doing work. Yeah, because there's always a great talk. There's always somebody new to meet. It was a beautiful location.
Yeah. Speaking of the location, it was in Montenegro.
Yes.
And why was Montenegro chosen as a venue for this pop-up city? Maybe you can share with us.
I wasn't part of the decision-making process, but it's a really beautiful country. It's one of the youngest countries in the world. And just personal connections from Vitalik were from Montenegro, or very bullish on the potential of Montenegro to be a hub in the future for frontier technologists, right? So the Montenegro has a new government, a new political party, and we had several chances to interact and meet with them and talk about our ideas. And they're very interested in becoming a hub for crypto and for longevity. And right now they're actually forming, or in the final stages of forming, a coalition, and are potentially even approving legislation to make that possible. So these kind of connections that were foregoing that made the organizers choose Montenegro as a launchpad.
And overall, Laura, how did you find the experience? Like, what was your kind of key takeaways? And did it give you did it ignite a hope that this is a direction we will move as a world, as a humanity, to find these kind of concentrated tribes, if you will?
So I have a very particular opinion about it, because I think a lot of how democracy has happened and humanity has evolved is because there's new groups that start new things and go against the grain. And I love the notion of that. And then the reverse flip coin of side for me is I have a very hard time seeing how in this day and age it's easy for sovereign nations to give up space. There has to be like a give and take, and obviously there has to be a proof of concept of where the give is good enough for actually giving back to that society that this new sovereign state would be taking space from. I'm Mexican, so there's a saying in Mexico that we say in Spanish is better when you say it, but it's too far from God, too close from the United States. Pardon my American friends. I love the United States, but it talks about that because we knew about what the quote unquote imperialism can do to you. And I've lived in places where sort of new modern states were created, and I think they're interesting. It's just finding that balance, and I think it's going to take some time. Because it's always, there has to be a give and take, right?
Yeah. I'm curious to hear your perspective on this, Niklas. Obviously, I'm assuming these are things you've thought about, the impact of the countries that this is happening within, and how to maybe not repeat some of the mistakes we've made in the past.
And also some of the projects you're currently involved in, because you are involved in a project that's currently in the Honduras, right?
Yeah.
And tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so I'm very involved with Prospera, which is a platform to build new cities in or through special economic zones, right? So they provide a different legal system. They provide governance services. So think Estonia. It's pretty much the same person who built Estonia e-residency is also the product director for Prospera, right? So they're using governance, innovation, and best practices from all over the world. So think Estonia, think common law-based legal system, which helped excel Hong Kong, right? And also the free zone model from Dubai is underpinning it, or just several of the successes of Shenzhen, China, for example, right? And using special economic zones and reform on a small scale to prove a different economic model that can then scale to scale bigger. And the ultimate goal of that is, or the benefit for the host country is economic development, right? So special economic zones made China wealthy, right? So China is basically full of special economic zones. They saw Hong Kong worked, then they made it the same model in Shenzhen, which grew from a poor fishing village with 30,000 people to more than 1,000x its GDP. So it shows what's possible if you allow sort of a partial legal change on a small scale. And I think the special economic zone model is also the best model that we have to prove that this can work, right? To prove new models or ways of governance on a small scale that can then inspire bigger nations or bigger civilizations to adopt some of these innovations or ideas.
I have something to say on that because I spent 10 years of my life going to Shenzhen. The special economic zones are about importation and exportation. But the big thing that is different in these models is that everyone there is Chinese. And it's so that the Chinese people do get the benefits of doing business at a, let's say, capitalistic level. And China was very smart at doing that. I guess with Prospera, is everybody in Prospera from Honduras? Not really. It's mostly foreigners.
No, it's 65% Hondurans.
Oh, that's great. Okay, well, good, because I think the big thing is when the people are not from the actual place, it feels like, oh, well, how is it going to benefit and go back to the people from their region?
And I think that there's kind of an even bigger question in this, right? Like if we're going to have new systems like this emerging, at what point do we start to see ourselves as, one human family, and what is that actually going to take? Then that I think when you're dealing with so much complexity across culture, it can be a very complex kind of path for us to figure out how to kind of get to together. And I'm curious everyone's perspective on this. What would it take for us to be able to start to see our sameness more than our differences? And will we ever get to a place, do you guys think, that we're able to put aside those differences and work together?
I'm personally a big proponent of global citizenship, right? Like I want to be considered as an Earth's planetary citizen rather than confined to a jurisdiction. But of course, there's certain complexity and nuances with the nationality that you are,
the loss of culture.
Yeah, and the loss of culture.
How much do you Sanaz identify with being Persian in the sense of the cultural kind of backgrounds, the influences?
I look at it, recently I started looking at it at just like a genetic level. Like, what does it mean for my genetics to originate from Persia? And I didn't, I only spent, 5 years growing up in Iran, and I've been all over the world since, and I want to continue my hope that one day, as I'm a member of a multitude of these network states, and that I'm able to be global and have a form of residency associated with any of these certain communities that are value aligned for me.
If I may also point out, what I think is one of the biggest problems in the world is that more than half the population, if not more, are trapped in places with bad governance. Right, so they don't have the opportunity or the passport to travel and work and live in other places where they could, 10 or 20x their income. Right, so if you're, a poor working mother in Haiti, you could, have 10 or 20x your income if you could move to the United States. And I think that is one of the biggest source of untapped talent and productivity and opportunity in the world for people to upgrade their lives or go to places where they can have a better life.
I think one of the key things here, how do you navigate this where this doesn't just become like some elitist, communities essentially that are super longevity focused and are looking at immortality, or they want to upload their consciousness, or maybe they want to be interplanetary citizens, but like how do we create systems in which this is available?
There's equality.
There's equality within that.
Yeah. So
And
Prospera is not
campaign?
Dubai, right? It's not a tax haven, and it's not for rich people. I know everyone there is involved, and 90%.
Shout out to Dubai.
Huh?
Shout
Yeah.
out to Dubai.
Yeah. And most people there are young entrepreneurs. And as I said, 65% are from Honduras, right? So about a third of the population is local people who are service workers. But many of them are very educated and very talented entrepreneurs as well. The other third is educated Hondurans from the mainland, for whom it's an alternative to going to the United States. Honduras loses more than 100,000 people per year to other countries, and those are often the most educated and the smartest one. Now they have an opportunity to not leave their culture behind and to upgrade or uplift their own country in the process. And only the other third are then sort of international sort of talent, capital, bringing a new set of ideas. I've made the first VC investment in a Honduran company, right? So I showed them how to use that. Yeah.
Wow.
The first ever VC investment
Incredible.
in a Honduran startup. I coached them for 12 months, right? It's incredible entrepreneurs there. And I was doing small contribution, and I want to do more of that in the future, showing them how they can get access to sort of best practices internationally of raising VC funding. I think that's where the ultimate potential is. So any of these places won't succeed or be part of a bigger positive trend. I mean, you can still make the lives better, and I have nothing against sort of wealthy people being amongst themselves. That's fine for me, but it's not what I want to do, right? So I want to create a model that can uplift also the poorest of the poor. There's actually another great example also in Honduras, a place called Ciudad Morazán, another charter city that's next to Choloma, which is one of the most dangerous parts of the country of Honduras, by extension, one of the most dangerous parts in the world. And they're offering a safe, gated community for poor people, right? Affordable housing, basic security services for $120 a month. The place is completely booked out and has a wait list. And it's all local Honduran people who are now sort of having the safety that they need to build a life and build a family and, get an income for themselves and rise above their current means. I think that's beautiful.
A true intergenerational intervention.
I think, Laura, you had some perspectives on this that you shared with me that were really illuminating, because you mentioned that, and it was an oversight on my part until you mentioned it, that this is also a form of colonization. And I was fascinated by your perspective.
So I said we're in a era where we're decolonizing. And the whole notion I said of this is how for a lot of people, what they see is the notion that people are arriving and taking up land, right? And I know, for instance, from being Mexican, that from going to one government to the next, it's a switch, it's a complete change. And when you go to these, and you mentioned it too, right? These unstable places, and you are experiencing that because that's what you've seen. I've seen the articles, and to me, it's almost like there's a perception problem if what people think is exactly what I told you, that there is like a rat. I've talked about how to, and for instance, I think Mexico was colonized, but I'm not going to be sad. It happened centuries ago. It was another time. I'm not one of those people that wants retribution or wants anything back from it. It's done. However, we're like in another place in society, and it just feels strange to be creating these spaces where I don't know how Prospera works, if anybody that's Honduran can come in and they can just do whatever they want. I do know, for instance, and it was necessary because it was a gated community, but gated communities in Latin America, they're huge. It's a way to keep gated communities have water, they have everything nice, and one like road next, it's like just dirt and no water and completely different.
And now for the first time, you can have the same thing for poor people that otherwise is only accessible to rich people.
Yeah.
Which is great. I just think that, there's a whole thing of the articles that I've read, and I think I mentioned it to other people that are involved in bringing the longevity space to Prospera, is I don't know if it's a good look when you read that there's like a lawsuit for 1/3 of the GDP of the country, or it's 2/3. You think, well, Honduran people are so poor. And it's probably just making a point. I get it. Legally, it's to make a point. But I don't know if to make a point is going so far that it would almost turn people off, because I do believe I'm all for new things. And I do want to see a network state succeed. But I was one of those, I made a lot of my longevity friends from always being the naysayer and be like, wait, if you talk about immortality and living forever, you're going to turn off a lot of people. And I want to say this for the network state, that though I am for it in concept, the execution of what people see being the network state advantage has to really be worked on, because otherwise somebody like me who doesn't know 60% of the population is from Honduras sees it's like, oh, these like guys from all over the world, these white dudes have a hard time right now.
But the first thing to do then is get the facts straight, not assume
Yeah,
things.
but I'm getting them straight with you. Do you think a lot of people get their facts straight when they read something on like Twitter?
I think that's generally good practice of people to get their facts straight. Of course, they'll say something negative about the work of other people.
When Human Rights Watch has like a thing talking about it, I would believe Human Rights Watch, right? I don't think they're like a whatever organization.
Yeah, but they also haven't gotten the facts right. We've written a piece in response to that.
Okay, but I'm going to tell you, I'm trying to be I'm biased, but when you have an organization that's really good work, give that perspective, why wouldn't I believe them?
Well, come visit. You see it for yourself.
I will.
Spend 6
I'm
months
always
there.
like,
I know
this is
everyone
why
who's
it's
involved
interesting
there,
to
so
have these
It's
discussions.
important to have these conversations.
because
Yeah.
I'm for all this progress, and I'm probably one person that will come and tell you, hey, instead of being, because we have a lot of these conversations which is hooray, like patting each other in the back, and no one is stopping we had this conversation about the artificial womb. Yeah. I'm for it 100%, and I meet people all the time that are not for it, and they give
I'm on the opposite end of the
Yeah,
spectrum
exactly.
for that.
And I don't want to be with people that tell me all the time the artificial womb is amazing. I want to hear the prospect of why women might be turned off by it.
Conversation is the only way that we're going to be able to tease out, and actually create a functional society. And I think, the whole reason we created this show is actually to be able to have people that have different views discuss topics, because as we, progress in our society right now, it's becoming more and more difficult, I think, to hear people that have different perspective. And I think that that's fundamentally very dangerous. But what I love to bring to conversations, yes, Nick?
No, okay.
Oh, you can say, yeah, is really looking at it in a pragmatic way, and this is kind of my last question that I'd love to explore is the freedom. So you were saying, Nick, that your reason for starting the network state is to be able to mobilize innovation. So what are the, absolute undeniable pros that a new model is laying the pathway for the future? And I'd also love to hear your perspective on, what are the genuine challenges and what are the things that we need to have more conversation around and solve for?
Well, back to what I said earlier, most people in the world, billions of people, lack access to good institutions. They're trapped in a condition where they don't have basic safety, right? And don't have access to opportunity or a labor market where they can earn money to support themselves and their family. And much of that is due to the rules we made, right? The borders we put up, especially. I think the borders we set up, national borders, are one of the most damaging regulations in the world, right? And I think what we can do with these new jurisdictions is create more spaces with opportunity for people, right? I hope that we can prove to make bigger versions of this where that can be in places where there's millions of refugees. So for example, in East Africa, right? I wish that Europe or the United States were also more permissive with their border and letting more people in, right? So we're doing way too little of that. But in the absence of that, I think, hopefully we find the opportunity to have other places where we can create the conditions that people need to thrive to provide them with what they're missing out on. And then the challenges is, of course, legitimacy.
Well, before we move on to the challenges, what about the advancement of technology? I'm specifically interested in that. I'm a tech founder myself. I know the frictions. How are you envisaging and how are you solving for frictionless innovation, and then also having systems of rigor and accountability?
So what is important with technology is to remove barriers for entrepreneurs, right? So entrepreneurs are the ones that give us life-changing and life-saving technology, right? So it's entrepreneurs and scientists that we need to uncover sort of how the world works, and then entrepreneurs to bring these innovations to market and at scale. And I think the process is quite hampered for both scientists and entrepreneurs, right? So we're putting up barriers for scientists to do scientific research. They have to apply for grant funding. The average age of a scientist or grant recipient is rapidly increasing. We're making it harder for renegade scientists who are trying out different worldviews or are researching areas that are under-researched, such as women's health, right? Or aging, right? So through that centralized bureaucratic paradigm, we don't get these areas funded, right? So, and you can extend that or look into many areas of life or technology. So after the science, we have pre-market approvals for new drugs, which have, over the last couple of decades, successively getting stricter and stricter and stricter. So they've been hamstringing innovation. And the same is with financial technology, right? So the reason that, hundreds of millions of people are unbanked in the world is because of a lack of access to formal institutions. Banks in most countries are oligopolies that use the power of the state and of regulators to fend off competitors, right? In this way, if you want to provide an alternative that provides people that don't have access to banking with access to banking, they're going to come after you, right? And they're going to come after you by putting up rules, licenses, and, basically having to. And that makes it much harder for businesses and for entrepreneurs to solve the world's problems.
And the challenges?
The challenge is, of course, legitimacy, right? So as you said, it's a new thing. There is misconceptions about it, right? So, and we need to address these misconceptions. We need to prove that we're doing a good thing. Like any new technology or any new trend, there is higher standards than us, right? So when people die of lack of access to drugs by the millions in the United States, nobody knows or cares about that. If only one person in Prospera would die because of a medical experiment, the whole world would scream, right? So that is something we have to be aware of, right? But at the same time, we don't want to stay outside of the mainstream. We want to become part of the mainstream. So we do that by just providing a better product that's safer, more accessible, and more inclusive, and better, as much better as possible in every possible dimension. Having these conversations, proof it works, proof it is safe, proof that nobody has to be afraid, right? And that can help you and with your life.
And you announced a new pop-up, right? That's happening in 2024 in Honduras. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah. So Vitalia is the result of a collaboration of myself together with AthenaDAO. And we are thinking of starting like a longevity city or a longevity network state that around the goal or the moral innovation that life is good and we want more of it, right? And that death is bad and we want less of it. And for the reasons that I talked about before, that all these barriers that are in place, we can't innovate fast enough. So longevity as a science or as a movement or as a market or an industry is, as I mentioned, severely held back, right? Because of the lack of science funding, because of regulatory capture, because of monopolistic practices by pharmaceutical companies. So we can or want to do that differently. And we want to put our first guidepost into Prospera and do a 2-month-long Zuzalu-like camp where we co-live and co-work together. It's not a decision that we will do a city there, right? In the end, it will be a bottom-up, community-led process We just want to start there because we think that's where we can achieve the most of what's currently possible. But it will be a community-led decision. We're looking at other jurisdictions as well. As I mentioned, we had conversations with Montenegro before. Uruguay is extremely friendly to special economic zones. It has very good governance and is very stable. I just come from Zanzibar, where the government is also very open-minded about these special economic zones and has introduced 2 new ones and is open to do more. So, but we want to for now start in Prospera, do a 2-month-long camp and bring our community there to figure these questions out, right? Because I think, when I talk and there's lots of information out there, some is misleading, I think. So, but if we can all get together in the same place and address concerns and talk about how we would do regulation right.
There is a lawsuit, right? That point is right.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but nobody expects really, as you said, it's to make a point. It's actually very important because if Honduras is losing or is basically taking away the acquired rights from Prospera, which is what they promised before in like 10 years long process.
Under another government.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And then you have this new one.
Sorry?
Then you have this new one. And then in how many years are you going to have another one?
I don't follow.
Meaning that you have a lawsuit because there was a change of power in Honduras, right? So how are you thinking of that change of power that's going to be constant in what's an unstable, poor region? How are you going to secure your rights long term?
Well, I'm not sure I follow what the question is. I mean, the point I wanted to make is if Honduras, the new government, reneges on the premises of the old government, that means Honduras will be shut for foreign investment for the foreseeable future, for the next couple of decades.
Because of this this lawsuit?
Not because of the lawsuit, because of their actions to question the acquired rights of the operators of the special economic zones, right? Because the previous legislation, the constitutional amendment, said.
Yeah, how are legal systems handling this?
Yeah.
Sorry,
I mean, no offense to Latin American countries, but a lot of them, even now in Canada, I can say we're living in banana republics, where the corrupt governments sell the rights and the land of and I've seen this in Mexico. I can speak from experience. The governments take everything for themselves, sell the rights to foreign investors, and do whatever they want. So they enrich themselves personally, and then maybe you're doing it with something that is like for good, but that's a history in Latin America where it happens over and over again. And maybe that's why there is that perception problem, because that is historically what happens in those countries where politicians enrich themselves and really they have more money than for generations of their kids than it's needed.
Yeah.
And they do it by taking away from the people.
Let me tell you an important story about Honduras, right? So the reform process came from inside Honduras, right? It came from, they only used a very prominent person, a Nobel Prize winner, Paul Romer, to find legitimacy for the idea. And the legislation that the founding fathers of that framework adopted is the best in the world in terms of the transparency and accountability it guarantees. Right. So I think what they created is really beautiful. It's a homegrown innovation to make Honduras a more decentralized model for governance.
The previous government.
It wasn't the previous government.
Before that, even.
Before that.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then the previous government implemented it, did this economic zones.
In practice, it was basically 3 people. So it's very hard to get these new economic zones adopted. Right. So it needs just a small team of typically 2 or 3 people that is pushing it forward. And they were able to do it in a way that I think is best practice, really, in terms of, again, transparency you would get out of it. And yes, that's how politics works, right? So you're saying the previous government was pretty bad and corrupt, and then we need to do everything different. But the problem is, if you always switch back and forth and then you go from one extreme to the next, then you can never have stability, right? So what these zones are supposed to do is ensure stability. So regardless if there's a really bad government left or a really bad government right, so you are able to ensure stability.
So this new government is left or right?
Far left.
Far left, okay. So it was, I mean, this is the thing that in Latin America is a big problem, because far left governments are always not liked, but they're the ones that actually do the most for the people usually. So is there a way, just asking, because now I'm getting the facts right from you, to work with that, to find a happy medium with that government?
And even in the future of network states, is politics going to look like this
Each
kind of
time.
yeah, but bipartisan, far left, far right structure?
Yeah,
or
'cause
can we
that's-
imagine a new kind of way?
You're right. It should be something that is beyond politics.
I mean, look what politics has done to the United States of America. You know, it's
Yeah, I agree. I think we should really outgrow these
Yeah.
old cleavages.
I think something new is birthing from a lot of this old structures,
Yeah.
right? And the legacy structures
100%.
that you talk about.
yeah, well, totally. I mean, legacy disorder. My next book is a diagnosis of global power structures. Literally, I write it as a psychological diagnosis.
So what are your thesis?
Well, I really explored the topic through what I'd call a compassionate lens. So I actually try to look at the human in their entirety, and why someone has such a need for power, and where that actually, you know, my interest, I guess, is more emotional and psychological, where that actually comes from. Not necessarily from a, you know, how society sees it, but intrinsically. And then also intrinsically, where does it come from for us, well, for the majority of people to give away their power in such a way that we have very few that hold, you know, 98% of the world's wealth. And, you know, this is a perspective I wanted to bring to this episode, is I think so much of these friction points actually need to be resolved through more consciousness, you know, through a spiritual evolution, and not just through you know, rigorous systems design, although that is so important. We need infrastructures that are going to hold us as we progress. But I think a lot of it comes down to our interiority, actually, and what work are we doing, you know, and I'm sure, you know, this is potentially part of the subject matter in your network states, or at least I hope it is. Love Out Loud's whole mission is to actualize the civilization of love by 2030. And I think largely that can be non-local. I think it can be a unification of humanity at large that's held together by values. You talked about the currency of loyalty, the currency of trust. I think if you strip back these systems, actually it comes back to these very core principles. Can we be loyal to one another? Can we choose what's compassionate? Can we be selfless and act in the greater good of all? Can we transcend this kind of reptilian selfishness that is within all of us? You know, these are the existential questions I think are actually, from my perspective, more important. And that's what I've tried to explore in the book, but also what I would love to see brought to more of these conversations.
That's beautiful.
Yeah, we are currently ancestors to these future civilizations, right? Whether they live in network states or they are off planet, or you know, this is why I actually came to this event, because I wanted to actually meet, you know, I read a lot of things online and I do my own research and I read a lot of books, but I came here to have these conversations and to meet
Likewise.
the people that are pushing these initiatives forward, because I want to also know where the heart is, like what is orienting you, what is your North Star, and if there is conflict, how can we find resolution? How can we imagine this together?
Yeah.
Well, I'm definitely very curious about network states working out.
Yes.
I am. I don't know if anybody's knew about Osho's Rajneesh Pura.
Yeah. One of my favorite documentaries
Exactly,
ever.
mine too. And I was fascinated because they built an amazing city. They had their own banking system.
Yeah.
They had the most
And
intelligent
after
people in the world.
Those people were still singing the praises.
But I think they actually got the first network state done. And to me, what's interesting, they
He was
did.
a visionary.
For
He
me,
was.
they were visionary. And
Yeah.
what's interesting to me is that they were driven out because people were
Rajneeshis.
not acceptant of the other.
Yeah.
And that's always,
They did
you
go
know,
a bit rogue when they tried to poison
they
all
went
of the
crazy.
local
But
council
I
members.
mean, think of how crazy it is that the only reason anybody paid attention to them is because the owner of Nike had a ranch around there. The only
Really?
reason.
They
They could
good on him.
Maybe they
Progressive.
could have been like, but I do
Yeah.
think that people who are like-minded getting together to do things is very powerful.
Yeah.
Because you can accomplish, and that's how most societies started, right?
100%.
Tribes, everything else. So this is a new technological tribe,
Yeah.
and it is going to happen.
And we've got to get it right on Earth, because by the time we start
Oh,
moving into planetary, we're really going to need these systems ironed out, I think.
Loyalty and trust is going to be a
huge.
major thing
Yeah.
going outside to colonies.
Maintained
Yes.
loyalty.
And
trust.
to say that I actually love that you named your DAO Athena, because I think the goddess of wisdom is present here today.
And war.
Yes.
And
war.
Yeah. Laura's representing. Nick, Laura, I'd love to introduce this conversation to our audience, and I'd love to potentially do a sequel, because I feel like there's a lot more for us to dive into. There's a lot more for us to explore. There's only so much we're going to be able to get through.
Let's
today.
do one after I might come back after Prospera.
Yeah, perfect.
Report back with the facts.
Exactly. With the facts. With the
Then I'm like,
facts.
I've seen it. It's all good.
Maybe you
Yep.
can do some video diaries, and we'll
And
show
be
some
like, I'm moving to
flashbacks.
Prospera. Bye.
So on that note, I've had a lot of fun. So thank you guys for this conversation. Final sort of reflection points, questions for our audience, things to consider, and then of course, how we can best support your work as a community. Both of you.
Yeah.
In women's health as well, not
Yeah.
just
How can our
advocating against network
So final
states.
word on the well, I think that a good point that was made here is the best way to find the facts is to actually try to
Go on the
go to
global
these
affair.
places, get involved, learn. For instance, we're in AthenaDAO is in the blockchain crypto space, right? And there's a lot of misconceptions about it. When you think of things like decentralized science, the movement that I'm part of, the fact that we can use crypto incentives and capital and people that just want to create new systems to fund areas of research that did not get any capital, it's insane. And it's what I think should be the best calling card of the space, the fact that we're trying to create advancement for society, not really to just, it's not a casino. There's a lot that's going on that it's actually to further society and humanity. So it's just, for me, perception is a big thing, really putting the best message out there. So obviously, if you, for me, the support is when people get involved with AthenaDAO, and having all of you talk about what we're doing is the best thing that you can do, word of mouth.
Great.
But
Shout out.
we need technology. It's because of technology that we live longer. It's because of technology that we can be on X and be here and do all these things. So
where can people join your community?
they can find us on X, AthenaDAO.co. Looking at AthenaDAO. I don't know if everybody knows how DAO is spelled, so DAO. And look at women's health research. I'm sure we're indexing already, but it's a community for scientists, enthusiasts, women, anybody that wants to advance that. Half of the world's population is ready for it. So hopefully we can count with the support of some of your audience.
Absolutely. Really encourage everyone to go and do that. Thank you, Laura. And Nick.
Yeah, so my pledge is, I'll start with a quote by Jessica Livingston, the founder of Y Combinator. And she said something interesting. She said that, and she's seen thousands and thousands of startups, that people like the idea of innovation in the abstract. But if you show them something concrete, they reject it.
That's so true.
Because they don't know it yet. And they don't trust what they don't know.
Things are safe conceptually.
Exactly. So our most important value for creating kind of a different world that's driven by technology is really of tolerance and withholding judgment. I think that's even from the 4 agreements, sort of don't judge. Right. So what is truly new and innovative, you will not know, and therefore you will not trust it. So withhold judgment and give sort of the innovators, the renegades, the ones that want to do things differently, the benefit of the doubt and withhold judgment, at least as long as they're not hurting anybody. Right. So of course there's basic rules like that. But until that, give them the chance to do things differently and withhold judgment and create the space where they can thrive. And so you can find me at infinitavc.com, and you can find my blog, Stranded Technologies, or my podcast, the Stranded Technologies podcast, where I have tons of conversations, including conversations with people who are skeptical about this trend. I talked to Primavera de Filippi on my podcast as well, welcoming more conversations like that. My pledge is again to keep talking to each other, to learn from each other. So what are we not seeing? I think there's always, in every time, something to be learned from someone, that you're not seeing something that they are seeing.
Niklas, thank you. And thank you, Sanaz.
Thank you for everyone being here, and such a amazing time. I've been really eager to have this conversation, so thank you.
Yeah.
Well, thank you.
Thank you.
It's great to be here.
Yay!
Good job, guys. Great discussion.
Yeah, this is fun.
Thanks for being patient online.